Hi there, and welcome to Enhancing Human Experience, the podcast designed to help you get the most out of life. And yes, I do have intro music now, something I've been wanting to do for quite some time, but you know, one of the issues is there's just a few songs to choose from out there. There's maybe like 5 intro songs to choose from, right? I mean, it's not like there's a million songs or anything. But actually, you know, I didn't listen to too many intros before I found this, and I was like, you know what? I like it. I'm going to roll with it. We'll see what happens down the road, but for now, this is the intro music. So let me know what you think about it through social media or on my website, gmarkphillips.com. I'd love your feedback. You can find all those links in the show notes for every episode on my website, gmarkphillips.com. So I'd love to get your feedback. So let me set up this episode. This is episode 22, and I sat down with my very good friend, Jana Mitchell. And Jana is a hospice nurse. You know, she is working with people who are at the end of their lives, you know, all the time, right? And she's dealing with death and dying constantly. And I think there's really something valuable we can learn from death, right? It makes us, it keeps us focused. It reminds us that, hey, you better do what you came here to do. Stay in your purpose, stay in your zone of genius, because human life is finite, right? And when it transitions, it transitions. No one knows when they're going to go, right? And even though it's a sad experience when we lose someone that we're close to, there's so much, you know, there's a positive side to death too, right? That we don't often see in the moment when it really sucks when someone passes, right? But I think it's really valuable to think about death in that way as like the great ally, right? Constantly urging us to do what's important, do what matters, don't put things off, you know, mend fences, remove grudges, just get rid of the silly pettiness that a lot of, you know, occupies a lot of the human experience and detracts from it, quite frankly. So she has a lot of good stuff to share. I really enjoyed this interview, and I think you will too. And on that note, let's get into it. So in today's episode, we're going to be talking about death. Interesting subject, but I really think that there's a lot to learn from death on how to enhance the human experience. And before I introduce my guest today, I want to share 2 quotes with you. And the first is from Stephen Covey and his book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And the second is from Leonardo da Vinci. And Stephen Covey said this: begin with the end in mind. And Leonardo da Vinci said this: as a well-spent day brings happy sleep, so a life well spent brings happy death. So on that note, I want to welcome my guest, Jana Mitchell, to the show. Jana is a hospice nurse and has worked in a number of different capacities within that industry. But why don't you tell us your background in hospice, Jana?
I started my nursing career at the hospital, which I would recommend any nurse does that. On the medical surgical unit. And initially I'd wanted to be a life flight nurse. So I started on a med surg unit, and I got on the code team, and I did the code team for about 6 months. And it took about 6 months for me to realize I didn't really want to be on the code team. Not because it wasn't exciting and it was great to save lives, but you're usually not saving lives. You're usually extending the lives of somebody who probably needs to go.
Someone who's been in a bad accident.
No, elderly people are usually who you code.
Oh, that's what I was going to ask you. Code, it's called code team?
Right.
Okay.
So you have someone who's already in the hospital, who's already getting life-saving therapies, and they die anyway. And then we try to bring them back to life. That's usually what the code team's doing. And on my very last code that I participated in, it was an elderly woman who clearly had end-of-life diseases going on. And her family was in the room because we had an open code policy, which is a great idea, so people know how hard you work to save the people they love.
Sure.
And the family was nowhere prepared. It was a child and then that child's child, so a child and a grandchild that were there. And of course, they were 60 and 40-ish. The patient was quite elderly. And one of them passed out and one of them was vomiting. So then we had nurses for them too. And they weren't ready. And that's what stuck with me is this was not a brand new diagnosis. This was something the woman had been living with or dying with probably for 10 to 15 years. And this time we weren't going to be able to save her, and they weren't ready. And then I thought about the cost we spend on keeping people alive, and that cost would be so much better put into education about how long we really do live. And it's not 100 years. It's still 76 years about. And that the hospital can't always put you back together. And so I would have rather seen money go into the community, into support groups, into bereavement groups, and into education on how to live well with a terminal illness. And
Sure.
so I, shortly after that, started seeking hospice.
So because of that, your experience there, you said, I want to put my energy into, you feel it was more beneficial in many ways.
Right.
Okay, so how many years you've been in hospice?
I've been in hospice since 2005, so 12 years.
Okay, 12 years. And what roles have you, I know you've done a lot of different roles within that industry.
So staff nurse or nurse case manager, I spend a lot of my time doing that. And that's really where the heart of it is. And I feel like I am very good at that. And so I became a manager after that. So there's lots of different titles depending on where you work. But it's a supervisor or clinical director or director of nursing. And I've been doing that for probably 5 or 6 years out of that 12 years.
Okay. And for people who don't know what hospice is, can you give us a definition?
Sure. Hospice is care in the community. So we come to where you live, whether you live in a skilled facility, an assisted living, in a regular house, in a trailer, in a teepee, we don't care. We come to where you're living. And it's when you have a terminal diagnosis with life expectancy of 6 months or less if the disease runs its normal course. And then you get the services of a nurse, of a social worker, a chaplain or a spiritual care provider, a certified nurse's assistant. I work for a great company. We also have massage therapy. We have a death doula. We have probably hundreds of volunteers. So we really do what we can to make that end of life not just comfortable, but living out some of those things we want to do before we die.
So it's like a team effort.
Oh, and there's a physician too.
And okay, of course, I guess that's important and true. Sure. And one of the questions I've always been curious about is, has hospice been around forever? Or what was before hospice? How did people die before hospice?
I should have studied up before I came.
Putting you on the spot. Give me the history, Jana.
So I hope I don't quote some wrong years. So back in the 80s, hospice was in America. Hospice was mostly for people dying of cancer. And just locally, hospice really took a turn in the early 2000s, at least in our area, to really expanding it. There were other ways you could get hospice before, but the community, the Ada County community and the Canyon County community really started utilizing hospice in the early 2000s. There was a big change, and that change was pretty consistent across the United States.
Really? So there's like a surge of people putting energy, well, counties and states putting energy into hospice.
Medicare figured out it saves money, which it does. You spend less money and you get more care, so it's really a great thing.
Sure.
And then, of course, our population's aging, so there's a real need for it.
Well, and that's one of the things that I also want to touch on and get your perspective on this. Like you just said, sometimes we put a bunch of money into keeping people alive. To what degree, right? How happy are they? Are they really like enjoying it themselves, which sometimes doesn't seem like it? Because our medical industry, it seems like they can pop a bunch of pills and do a lot of stuff and extend life, but not always the best thing. I mean, what's your perspective on that? Yeah,
we have the ability to really extend life, at least 20 years if we want to, in a lot of cases. And some people, I think, have projected that people should be able to live 120 and 130 years.
I've heard that.
I say no, thank you.
Well, you're right. If the last 30 sucks, what's the point, I mean... I keep thinking about, you hear these stories of people like Albert Einstein and other people who are like, they get an illness of some sort and they're like, no, I'm going to let this take me out, right? I'm not going to go to crazy extremes. I mean, does that happen with people in hospice, or do you find most people want to extend their life, like regardless of whatever else?
It has so much to do with how you've lived your life as how well you die. And I have been to many conferences in the United States, and it is different in the rural community, how we live and how we die. And I'm from a rural community, and I'm serving a rural community, so that's really, I'm on board with the rural folks and how they live and die.
Oh, so in what sense? How is it different?
Fewer life-extending measures.
In the rural community.
Right. You can have life-extending measures in hospice, but in rural communities, people are less likely, in my experience, to choose those. And I have a theory about it.
You're going to share that? You can't tease us and not share it. Come on.
So a farmer, I'll give an example of a farmer. You see the life cycle all the time as a farmer. You plant, it grows, you tend to it, you harvest, you get your cows, have babies, you raise the cow, there's a death, and there's really life cycles in farming. And so it's not a foreign thing that your life is also in a life cycle.
It makes perfect sense. Well, and kind of segueing in with that statement, you're dealing with death every day. How has that, or has it, changed your perspective on life?
So I think people get a calling to hospice. So there's usually, not always, but most hospice nurses I know who've continued to do hospice nursing, it's a calling before you actually become a nurse or you even enter into hospice because of your life experiences up till then. And not to say that's everybody's story. People have different stories. And certainly there's many nurses who do 2 years of hospice and it's kind of like a time served.
Sure.
And they move on to something else. So I was raised to believe that there's worse things than dying. And so you need to be let live and let live.
Yeah.
And I grew up in a family where you were allowed to do all kinds of wild things.
You get it all out of your system, right?
Right. And I'm so thankful for that. I also lived in a community where kids died. That might be because of the wild things. And so I think the stats back then for our county were at least 2 kids that you grew up with were going to die, and that's 2 kids in your group. So that meant 2 of my friends, 2 of my sister's friends, 2 of my brother's friends, and that's actually very consistent with how we lived. And then my best friend, I met her and when we were 11 years old, and she had an illness where her life expectancy was 18 years old.
Oh.
And so it was very normal that you're not going to live forever. And since there was a normalcy to it. And then as I got older and I had my own children, I realized what a gift her parents had given her, because she was allowed to play with us and do everything normal kids were going to do, even though she could have a heart attack at any time.
Oh, really?
So they let her live her life, and that was a real testament to me on how to live your life.
And that's a great illustration. Well, and that's the other thing, when we're talking about how to live while you're alive. Like some people go through life and they're not really even living, right? And
right.
and we're all on the spectrum somehow. Do you see people at the end of their lives, that have deep regrets? And if so, what kind of things do they regret? Or do they share that with you?
The worst regrets I see, or at least the ones that really stick with me, are unforgiveness and hate and not mending your fences with your family, or not forgiving your parents, or a parent who's unforgiven. And this is one of my little jokes, is we all stink. We're all not great human beings all the time. And so learning that you should forgive your parents and your siblings and your kids and really accept people just how they are, and you're going to live a much better life. And it's really sad when someone hasn't talked to their kid for 40 years and they still don't get to talk to them before they die. Or even if they do get to mend that fence before they die, which is the best case scenario, there's still horrible grief on both parties for letting 40 years roll by.
Yeah. So they come back together and there's this, why didn't we do this earlier, right?
Because most things people hate each other for are petty or misunderstandings.
Yeah. I would agree with that. That ego gets in the way and is like, you wronged me 40 years ago, but you took this thing from me and now it's all going to be a huge issue. Yeah. Well, I think that's a really good way to look at it. Well, I think that's great perspective. I really appreciate you stopping by and sharing that. I know some people, like you said, if they're not called for it, they're not going to be able to do it.
Well, and it's not a great job if you're not called for it. Anybody in nursing or healthcare can say that. It's a lower middle class wage. It's very livable, but it's lower middle class, and you work weekends and you work holidays and you work nights and you're on call, and you get told all kinds of secrets. And I mean, there's all kinds of drama. So unless you have a calling for it, it's not really something you'd sign up for. I
can't imagine. I mean, in our culture, death is something people don't really talk about. And I think that's a little ways unfortunate. I sometimes over the last number of years have looked at death as like the great ally that's always there saying, hey, you better get your, what done, because I'm going to be waiting for you at some point in life. But just, it doesn't seem like most people kind of are in that mindset,
It's just like that quote that from Covey is.
Which one?
Live with the end in mind.
Yeah. Oh, sure. Yes, exactly. Yes. And whenever I attend a funeral of a friend or family member, it kind of wakes you up and it makes you realize it gets you going again and get you back on track, because we have a tendency to kind of just flake off to a degree. So
my kids, which of course having a hospice nurse as a mother makes their lives a little different. We had gone to a funeral of their grandmother, whom they loved dearly. And somebody put together this wonderful video. I think that people do that at a lot of funerals. So there was all kinds of photos. And there was some very nice, expensive group photos that were taken by professionals. And then there was grandma and my kids doing stuff.
Sure.
And that's what my kids had remembered, is they thought it was so strange that their photos were the only ones of them doing stuff, like fishing or going to a parade or doing things. And so, and they were like, why would you want to do? Nobody wants to dress up and go to the photographer. Why is that a memory? So it was kind of fun to see their perspective.
Well, plus they're boys, and they're like, this is, that's stupid. What's the point, right? I don't need to put all that on, pomp and circumstance, right? Well, thanks for stopping by. I really do appreciate it.
Sure.
All right. Until next time, all the best, health, wealth, and success. Bye-bye.